Hi everyone, my name is Emily.Finch. I work with the Daviess, Dubois, and Martin County Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and my position is Invasive Species Specialist. So my whole job is dealing with various invasive species, and part of that is educating landowners and members of the public about what invasives we have in the area and what we can do about them. So today for your class, I'm going to do an overview of what invasive species are, as well as a highlight of several local invasive species that we have here in southern Indiana. First off, what is an invasive species? Well, believe it or not, we do have an official definition of invasive species because over the years we've realized that we have to regulate them to a certain degree. So I like this definition that was from a presidential executive order in 1999, and it defines an invasive species as a species that does not naturally occur in a specific area and whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So essentially, you have something that's not native and it causes harm. Those are the two big things there. And we like to compare this to what a native species is. And a native species is a plant or an animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time, essentially to develop complex and essential relationships with the environment and other organisms. Think of the web of life, how everything is interconnected. Another good example of a species that's native and how it has relationships with the rest of the world around it would be monarchs and milkweed. So our milkweed species had developed, a certain sap in the plant that is toxic to a lot of animals. So a lot of animals can't eat milkweed. But because monarchs have been in the same environment with it for so long, they have developed that ability to feed on it and have essentially become a specialist in that regard. They need milkweed to survive. And all of the different plants that we have in our ecosystem have these different relationships. So with one or more different animals and other organisms in the same area, even down to trees that rely on certain fungi in the soil in order to germinate. And the reason why this is important to highlight is because invasive species, because they're not native to an area, they disrupt a lot of these relationships. And they don't provide the same benefit that a lot of our native species do to the rest of the wildlife and other organisms in a natural area. So when we look at invasive species, we have them everywhere you look, every type of habitat. So we have our terrestrial invasive species that are on land. Plants tend to be what we focus quite a lot on when it comes to invasive species because it's something that we can do something about. Individual landowners can do a lot to control what is growing on their property. And then there's also animals, emerald ash borer, which is an insect, but also things like feral hogs, and believe it or not, feral or wild cats are also considered a pretty major invasive species across the globe. And in water, whether it's lakes or rivers, we also have aquatic invasive species. And this gets a lot of attention because obviously our aquatic invasives can't just walk out of the water and go to another lake. So they really are introduced and spread almost solely by humans. So you have various different plants that are in the water that are invasive, as well as animals, things like zebra mussels, Asian carp, sea lamprey, a whole slew of different types of invasives. Now, not all non-native plants and animals are invasive. We have a slew of various things that we have brought here to North America, to the US, that are not native, but they don't cause any harm. So here is a good graphic kind of looking at how when we take invasives, we're looking at things that are both not native, but also things that cause harm. So that's where our honeysuckles, Callery Pear, purple loosestrife, those things kind of fall. Things that might not be native that are not causing harm here. A lot of our landscape plants like peonies or tulips, but also a lot of our agricultural crops, a lot of the food we eat is not native to North America. Basil is just one example there. Likewise, there might be many things that people would be surprised to hear aren't invasive because they are actually native to Indiana. So poison ivy, you might not like it, and people might need to control it if it's in their backyard and it's an area that they go in a lot, but it's not considered invasive. In our natural ecosystem, birds and wildlife don't have the same reaction to poison ivy oils as humans do, and they actually love to eat the fruit in winter. They'll have little white berries that they will eat. Water hemlock is toxic, ragweeds, pokeweed, a lot of our agricultural weeds that might be a problem in a farm field aren't actually problematic in natural areas. In fact, our wildlife will eat the seeds from ragweed, and birds love the berries on pokeweed. The real characteristic of invasives is that when they get into natural areas, they change the look, but also the function of our ecosystems. And I'll have a few examples with specific species here. So Amur bush honeysuckle. The Midwest has several species of bush honeysuckle that are invasive, and Lonicera mackay is the most common here in southern Indiana. You will see these pairs of opposite leaves there. It was planted a lot for landscaping, and you can notice, the very pretty tubular looking flowers, but it's much more robust than native bush honeysuckles that we have. It will have berries that are usually red. The bark on these multi-stem shrubs kind of looks kind of shaggy there, and it has many of these arching branches. It can grow quite dense and be very hard physically just to get to the base of a plant to cut it to control it. Small plants are easy to just pull out of the ground. The roots are pretty shallow. And let's go on to the impacts. This photo is actually a photo I took in Daviess County with a landowner we are working with. And Amur honeysuckle, one of the things it does is it puts out its leaves early in the spring before most of our native plants have leaves on them. So this is when maybe a few of the trees are just barely starting to open their leaves, and this whole understory underneath them is just chock full of bush honeysuckle. It's the only thing that's green. And that is an advantage that the honeysuckle has, because what do plants need? They need sunlight. And so the longer that a plant can have its leaves open to take advantage of that sunlight, the more food and energy it can make to help it grow bigger, stronger, faster. Now, honeysuckle is one of those species that we've had for a while. And the longer that we've had some of these invasives, there's been more research done. And we're finding various ways that it impacts our natural world. First off, they have found that this plant is very bad for birds. So a lot of people will have honeysuckle in their yards, and they might see the birds just flocking to it, eating all of the berries, and think that it's beneficial because it's providing food. But when they analyzed the fruit of bush honeysuckle, they actually found that from a nutritional standpoint, it was far poorer than the fruit of a lot of our native shrubs. And it might not seem like a big deal if you have a lot of it. Well, at least it's providing a lot of food. But what happens is migratory birds that might fly from here down to the Gulf of Mexico or even further, they need berries that are very high in fat content to provide that energy for migration. So if you have bush honeysuckle here instead of your native shrubs that provide that good nutrition, they essentially fill their stomachs with with these berries, and they feel full, but they're not getting the same nutrition out of it. It's essentially junk food. Another study found that birds that nest in bush honeysuckle, as compared to birds that would nest in native shrubs, had much less success. So their nests would fail, the eggs would die, or their nests would have predators come and eat the young. So they did not have very much nesting success. Another impact that we found, there's actually a couple of invasive shrubs that have had this association, is increased numbers of ticks that can carry diseases. When it comes to them impacting the actual environment they are around, honeysuckle is one of the species that we call allelopathic. And allelopathic means that the plant puts chemicals into the soil from its roots. And those chemicals actually make it harder for other plants to grow. Soil is very, very complex. There's a lot of microbes and chemicals and things going on in the soil, and whatever it is that honeysuckle is releasing makes it more advantageous for it to be growing there and makes it harder for other plants. They've also found that in forests that have been invaded along streams, the leaf litter from honeysuckle leaves can even change the water chemistry. All right, on to a tree that is an invasive species. This is one that many of you might have in your front yards. It's called Callery Pear, or one of the more common names for it is the Bradford pear. And it is the ornamental flowering pear trees that you see first thing in spring. And they have been widely planted in Indiana. The story of this tree is that when it was first introduced, the cultivar or variety that was introduced was called Bradford pear. And pear trees need to be cross-pollinated. They need another tree other than themselves to pollinate their flowers to produce fruit. And fruit trees and a lot of our flowering trees, they're not grown from seed in nurseries. They will take branches off of them and graft them onto new roots. So they essentially clone these trees. So when the only tree available was the Bradford pear, all of the Bradfords that were being planted were genetically identical, and they could not pollinate each other's flowers. However, it was such a popular tree because they grow very quickly and they're very pretty that they produced several other cultivars. And those other varieties, Cleveland Select, Aristocrat, Capital, suddenly there were other genetic individuals out there, and they were able to pollinate the flowers, and they started producing these small, round, brown fruit. And suddenly, they had seeds, they had fruit, and birds would eat all of these seeds and go and spread them everywhere. So these days, you can see them quite a lot along roadsides and spreading into our natural areas. So here is a photo. We actually had a company with a drone. It takes some photos in Martin County. And this is just one of the areas. He took it in spring, so you can see that all of these trees are essentially Callery pear. There's one cedar tree here, so that's one thing, that's something else. But almost everything here is Callery pear. So Callery pear has a competitive advantage because it grows very, very quickly. In fact, the trees can start reproducing and producing fruit in as little as 3 years, which is crazy fast for a tree. They cause a lot of economic damage, even though the trees that are sold in nurseries don't have thorns on them. When we get these wild seedlings that grow, they kind of revert back to their natural state, so they will have these very large, stout thorns, a couple inches long. and those have actually been known to puncture tractor tires. Also, as you can see in this picture, even though they're promoted a lot for landscaping, they're actually a really poor choice for it. The branching structure of Callery Pear leads it to be prone to splitting during high winds or ice storms. So that can result in an expensive tree removal, but also property damage if it falls on a house or a car. Because of this branching structure, it's one of the reasons the trees don't actually live that long. They grow very fast, but they don't last very long. And of course, in natural areas, or even just on roadways and fields, we get these dense thickets where Callery Pear will exclude other species. We're very concerned about it moving into forests and shading out native species, native trees. And I mentioned, it's spread by birds. Ironically enough, a lot of the time what will happen is there'll be these large flocks of starlings, which are another non-native species that are eating all of these fruit and then roosting on power lines near roads and spreading all of these seeds. Okay, another very common invasive that we have here in Indiana is Japanese honeysuckle. So this is another honeysuckle, but this one is a vine instead of a shrub. And it was introduced for a variety of reasons. Ornamental because of the flowers again, but it was also widely planted for erosion control and even wildlife habitat. It is one of the few species, invasive species, that some of our wildlife will actually eat. So deer will eat honeysuckle vines. Unfortunately, even with our amount of deer in the woods, it's not enough to keep honeysuckle in check. It still gets a little crazy. Similarly to the bush honeysuckle, you get these pairs of opposite leaves. But if you've been looking at these ones up here and wondering what's going on, honeysuckle, just to trick us, when it has new leaves kind of earlier in summer or in spring, they get these lobed effect where they almost look like mini oak leaves. And as you can see, they kind of lose that as they get older and they look a little more normal. It is a woody vine. It can trail on the ground or it can climb. Produces black berries, and just like the bush honeysuckle, not only does it green out early, it actually will stay green most of the year. So even in winter, a lot of the time you will see this with green leaves. So this is a picture from also Daviess County, where a landowner had quite a bit of Japanese honeysuckle going up into some of his trees. And this was taken before the trees had leaves on them, so you can see all of that green in that picture is Japanese honeysuckle. So the fact that it's green almost all year is definitely a competitive advantage. The vines grow very quickly, literally outgrowing everything else. And I don't have a picture of it, but the vines also will twist around the trunks of trees. And this is very dangerous because it can girdle the trees. So if you remember in biology and how plants move nutrients and water from one end of the plant to the other end, the xylem and phloem, on a tree trunk that is right underneath the bark. So what happens if that area is damaged, or if you have something twist really tight around it, you literally cut off that flow of nutrients from one end to the other. So it can girdle trees that way. On small young trees, it just grows over the entire tops of them. So they die that way. Even if trees survive it, the honeysuckle in the trees essentially ruins a lot of the timber value, because when it twists around the trunk, the wood that's a result of that will be warped. The tree also simply won't be as healthy, so it won't grow as large or as fast. And for other plants underneath the trees, you'll get these big mats of vine up in the tree that really shade out everything below them. Okay, here's another one, and the only silver lining for Japanese stiltgrass is we didn't introduce this one on purpose. So Japanese stiltgrass is an annual grass, so it only grows for one season. It doesn't come back from the same roots in the following year. And if you pull up an individual plant, it really looks kind of weak and wimpy. It doesn't look like something we should be worried about. But Japanese stiltgrass succeeds in numbers. So this whole area here on this trail is just covered in Japanese stiltgrass. They think that it was introduced to the US as packaging material, likely kind of dead grass cushioning porcelain being shipped from Asia. And since then, it's really been moved around by humans. So it's very shade tolerant, which is why we're concerned about it moving into forests. Trails and roads are where you'll find it first a lot of the time. The seeds can be spread in dirt that might be on tires or in your boots when you're hiking. It has alternate leaves, and if you look at an individual leaf, see this little silvery, shiny bit right there? It has a vein that runs not quite dead center of the leaf, down the middle, that's shiny, and that is very distinctive to Japanese stiltgrass. You won't find other grasses with that shiny silvery midrib. It actually, right about now in September, is when this plant is producing seeds. So that is the tricky thing for controlling it, because they will germinate in the beginning of summer, flower and seed at the end of the summer, and it leaves a much narrower window to control this plant. So the impacts of stiltgrass. These are some pictures of stiltgrass in winter. So I already mentioned competitive advantage. It is well adapted to low light. It also produces abundant seeds. So the seeds are spread very easily to new areas. Another way that it's spread is if it's along a creek, water flooding will move those seeds. Mowing equipment can also spread the seeds because the plant produces a secondary flower at the very base of the plant right next to the ground. And if they are continually mowed throughout the year, it actually increases seed production at the base of the plant. So people will be mowing it. I've even seen it in people's lawns, thinking that they're controlling it that way, and in fact it's still already preparing to produce more seeds all along. These large dense infestations that it creates crowd out native plants. They reduce the growth of new tree seedlings. So a forest has a lot of big trees, but if you want a forest to stay a forest, eventually those trees are going to die, and you need to have new seedlings that have been growing to replace them. And I do have one more here. So the other thing, when these big patches of stiltgrass die in winter, you don't have any living roots in the soil. So they've basically crowded out all these other perennial plants that might just be dormant over winter and come back the next year, and replaced it with something that dies every year. Okay, moving away from plants and moving to animals. Emerald ash borer is something that you folks might have heard of before. It's, I want to say famous, it's a notorious invasive species that moved through our area just in the last probably 5 to 10 years is when it moved through our area, and Evansville is now kind of the leading edge of this invasive. So emerald ash borer is a small insect, and you can see how it gets its name from its green wings, from Asia, and it was first discovered in southeast Michigan in 2002. They think that it had probably been there for a decade prior to that. And our best guess is that it was brought to the US on wood packing material. So you think like pallets and crates. A lot of the time they are just thrown together with rough cut wood that's never been heat treated or treated with any chemicals, so the insects can be in that wood. Since 2002, it has spread quite a lot, often hitchhiking on firewood, and it's now found in 35 states and 3 Canadian provinces. So emerald ash borer, as the name implies, feeds solely on ash trees, but most of the damage isn't done by the adult beetles. It's actually done by larvae before they become adults. Underneath the bark of the tree, you can see in this background picture here, they will tunnel around through the bark, and when they are when they're mature and ready to emerge as an adult, they'll leave these little exit holes in the bark of the tree that are shaped like a D, like the letter D. And as I mentioned before with the honeysuckle girdling trees, that's essentially what emerald ash borer does, because it's tunneling through that xylem and phloem area, the cambium of the tree, and it's cutting off all the flow of nutrients. So it can take a while for a tree with emerald ash borer to finally die. And if it's stressed from something else, maybe there's a drought or another disease affecting it, it can die quicker. But that is how emerald ash borer kills the tree. And here is a map from this year for how far emerald ash borer has spread. So all of the red dots are when it has been detected in counties, and there is actually a federal quarantine on wood products because they are trying to prevent it from spreading further or to slow its spread. So that's what that blue outline is. And you can see sometimes you get these outlier populations like county out in Colorado that obviously the little tiny beetles that can only fly about a mile or two did not go out to Colorado on their own. We would have found much more in between. However, what they suspect happened is that it was brought there probably on firewood, although other wood products is possible. In many of these states, the first known populations of emerald ash borer in various locations have quite often been by campgrounds and other areas where people were moving firewood. So the impacts that emerald ash borer has are quite severe. And it's because even though in Asia, where the emerald ash borer is, the ash trees there don't all die from it because they have evolved along with emerald ash borer. They have developed defenses for it. So the emerald ash borer might feed on them, but never quite completely kill the trees. But for our trees here, emerald ash borer is brand new. So we are still studying to see if there are trees that exhibit kind of a natural immunity, but it is a long road with that research. Since its discovery in the US, emerald ash borer has killed over 50 million trees. And part of the big impact that it has had is that ash trees have been planted quite a lot in urban areas. So here is a before and after from Toledo, Ohio, where you can see a road that was planted with just ash trees before and after emerald ash borer came in. And this is very, very costly because not only are you losing a beautiful tree canopy, but you can't, in an urban area, if a tree is dead, it's much more likely to fall and hurt someone or fall on someone's house. So cities and towns can't let all these dead standing trees stay there. So it costs them a lot just to cut down these trees, let alone if they want to plant new trees. So in Ann Arbor, it cost them $4 million to cut down their ash trees, and Chicago was estimating that it would cost $150 million to cut down and replace their trees. Of course, ash are also a very important species in a lot of forests. So when you have a tree that's a large part of the forest and they all die, within a few years, it changes that ecosystem quite a lot. There are at least 21 species of butterflies and moths that feed only on ash trees, that need them as part of their life cycle. And just removing that many trees from a forest canopy essentially is a very large disturbance. There's a lot more light that's reaching the forest floor, and it's all at once and it's immediate. In several areas, unfortunately, they've found that areas where ash trees have died, a lot of invasive plants have moved in. So, all right, so we will switch from land to water. Here we have Eurasian Watermilfoil, which is one of our more common aquatic invasive plants. We have a native milfoil, but the Eurasian one is much more aggressive. It has these finely dissected leaves that are whorled around the stem, so it almost looks kind of feathery in appearance. In fact, one of the ways that this plant can be distinguished from our native one is taking each of these little tiny leaves and counting how many leaflets are on it. A single stem of Eurasian Watermilfoil can reach up to 30 feet long. And in fact, that is one of the ways that milfoil spreads. While it produces seeds, its stems will also very easily break off. And each of these little nodes where the leaves are attached can actually put down roots when it floats to a new part of a lake, or say it hitches a ride on a boat trailer to a new lake. Those little fragments can grow into new plants. So the impacts of Eurasian Watermilfoil. Well, first off, it has a competitive advantage in that not only does it grow fast, but it grows differently than our native watermilfoil. Normally, aquatic plants will start at the bottom of the lake, and they'll grow to the surface, the water surface, and then they'll stop. But Eurasian Watermilfoil, one of the reasons its stems can get so long is when it reaches the surface of the water, it continues growing. So you get these huge, dense mats of vegetation. And those mats restrict any light getting further down in the water. They push out native vegetation, macrophytes, the little animals that live in the water that feed our fish, show a decline in areas with watermilfoil. It also can reduce habitat for fish that might need something else to spawn on in the water, to put their eggs on. And from a recreational standpoint, this is hard to get through if you are in a boat. And one of the Eurasian Watermilfoil also highlights one of the ways that invasive species can have an economic impact. Studies in several states have shown that people that own property on lakes that are invaded with Eurasian Watermilfoil end up having reduced property values. So I know I wouldn't want to live on a lake overlooking all these mats of just Eurasian Watermilfoil. I wouldn't want to go swimming in it. I wouldn't want to go boating in it. So I can definitely see reduced property value. Okay, we're moving out of the water back on land. I think this is our last invasive we're going to talk about. And that is feral hogs or wild pigs or wild boars. They've been called many things. And this is probably one of the worst invasives across the globe, and definitely in North America. Luckily, in Indiana, you are not likely to run into this invasive. So far, they've only identified feral hogs in 3 counties in Indiana. I know that because prior to my current position, I actually worked with USDA APHIS Wildlife Services on their feral hog removal project. So the story of how feral hogs or wild pigs came to be in North America is multi-part. So back in the day, a wild boar from Russia and Eurasia were brought to North America for hunting. And other lines of pigs, that we have on farms were also brought over. And the wild boar would interbreed with some of the domestic swine, especially if they got out. And so that's kind of what we see in the US today, is a mix of different traits for our feral hog populations. So sometimes they look more like the Russian boar with large tusks, and sometimes you find them, as you can see in this picture here, where they get more mottled looking or lighter fur, shorter snout. And it's one of the things that USDA tracks is their genetics. And it's one of the ways that they can look to see if feral hog populations are being moved around the country. Some people will purposefully take them from certain areas and move them to others. The southern US particularly has a problem with this species. So it is illegal to release these animals. Now the impacts, and this is a long list. So feral hogs have a lot of competitive advantages. They are very good at surviving. They have high reproduction rates, so females can have 2 to 3 litters per year. They're very, very adaptable, and they're omnivorous. So they'll eat acorns, they'll eat plants, they'll eat grubs or eggs from ground nesting birds, small invertebrates, lizards, and even small mammals. There have been reports of feral hogs attacking and killing white-tailed deer fawns. So in some parts of the country, they're a very big problem in areas like the Great Smokies, trying to protect endangered salamander species, because they will eat those. Then, in addition to directly preying on some of our wildlife, they also cause a lot of damage from feeding, rooting, which is what this top photo is, where they will basically dig down and turn over sod and parts of the dirt, looking for grubs and other things to eat. Wallowing, feral hogs don't have sweat glands, so they will actually create mud wallows, and that can negatively impact water quality and increase erosion. They cause a lot of damage to agriculture, but also lawns and golf courses. And in natural areas, this can kill a lot of the native plants in there. It can introduce invasive species. And in addition to all of that, if that weren't enough, feral hogs carry a lot of diseases that can be spread to livestock, pets, and humans. So in addition to the genetic testing that USDA does in their control program, they also will take samples to monitor for different diseases that the hogs can spread. Okay, so now that I've done all the doom and gloom, what can you do to help? And first off, the thing that I always like to drive home is that everyone can help slow the spread of invasive species. So there are several campaigns going nationwide all about invasives. Play Clean Go is one of my favorites, trying to encourage people that are out recreating, whether it's hiking or biking or camping, to slow the spread of invasives by cleaning their gear and not spreading invasives from one spot to another. We talked about firewood and emerald ash borer, and not moving firewood is one of the biggest things that you can do. So the recommendation is to burn it buy it where you burn it. So if you're going camping and it's not, literally down the road from your house, if you're going to another county or another state, wait to get your firewood there, whether you gather it in the woods or whether you buy it at the campground that you're going to. There are some stores selling heat-treated firewood. That comes with a little seal that lets you take it wherever you want to, because it's already been treated with heat to kill any insects that could be on it. And to stop aquatic hitchhikers, when people are out boating, We recommend that they clean, drain, and dry their boats. So not just removing weeds from the trailers like Eurasian Watermilfoil, but other invasives can literally be in the water. That might be in a live well on your boat, little zebra mussels, and other things that can be too small to see with the naked eye. So draining all the water and drying. So you can also, if you want to take it a step further, actually report invasive species locations. So there's a great website, edmaps.org. It stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. They have a ton of information on their website, but they also will accept reports to help map invasives so we can track their spread. And they have a smartphone app that you can use too. It's a nice, almost little pocket field guide to help you out when you're outside to identify things. Now, teachers, if you want to kind of continue the learning and find out more about invasives, some of the questions I would recommend following this presentation are thinking about the term invasive. Students, have you heard that term before? What did you think it meant? Do you feel differently about it now? If invasives are bad, why have so many been introduced on purpose? How might some of those desirable features actually make them more likely to be invasive? Or, we talked about feral hogs. How might controlling invasives be complicated by economic, environmental, or social factors, particularly if you're controlling an invasive animal? So some things that you guys can discuss. And lastly, there are ways you can learn more about invasives. If you guys want to continue talking about this, different project ideas, go out in your own backyard. See what you have growing there. Especially look at your landscaping. You might have invasives in your landscaping. I talked about the EdMaps app. Why don't you visit a local park, see what invasives you can find there. Or if you want to have a research project, two different ideas. Pick an invasive species that's not covered in the presentation that I just did. Find out how it was introduced to the U.S., where it's invasive, what those negative impacts are. And also, I didn't touch on it, but we do regulate invasive species in Indiana, so you can research how that is done. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. And if your teachers would like me to follow up with anything, I certainly can if you guys have questions or other things that you want to learn about. So thank you.